Large chunk mnemonics. We're going to start off talking about the Loki method, and that's what this method is usually called. And it comes from this senator who was part of was having dinner at this large party, and he was in this theater, and he could remember where everybody was sitting just based on his spatial memory. He could remember where each person was sitting, and so he could identify all the dead bodies and who they were, what families to contact, just based on his spatial memory. So it comes from that Loki, meaning location. And the Loki method is split up into three parts. It's split up into the environment, understanding the environment, understanding the objects that exist in that environment, and understanding the connections, how those objects are connected to the environment, and also sometimes to each other. So what is the difference between environments and objects? What is an environment? What is an object? Well, any environment is really a collection of smaller things. I mean, if you go down to the physics level of everything is made up of atoms, or everything is made up of chemical elements, everything is made up of energy, or everything is made up of these things that we can't even see, that are microscopic. So that's at the smallest level, but really what we're talking about is an environment is something that's static, where it's not going to move, it's not going to shift around unless some act of God, some earthquake or something else major happens that destroys the environment. So that environment can be the earth, that environment can be a building, anything that's permanent, that's not designed to move, that's always going to be in one place, always going to exist in one way. And obviously our environments change over time, our homes change over time, the interior, the exterior changes over time. So part of what you have to do is lock in a certain configuration of your environment so that it stays static, and it's a place where you can safely store things and not forget how they're organized later on. So best way to do that is to just take pictures of things. If you have a panorama function, use that. And in terms of objects, an object can become a container in and of itself. So if you look at it in enough microscopic detail, and over time, as you learn this visual language, you start paying more attention to the design of different objects, and just looking at, okay, how does this work mechanically? What are all the different pieces to this? Because you need that information in order to get more value out of each object. And if you zoom into any object, eventually it can become an environment in and of itself. So you can zoom in on something and turn it into an environment if you really need to. And that's what helps you store more and more levels of hierarchy. So the important thing about environments is that you have to have unique places where you can store objects, where you can attach objects to. So if your environment is just like you're inside a perfect sphere, there's nowhere to store information. Or if you're inside a perfect cube white-walled room, there's nothing to do with that. There's nowhere to store information in that, because there's no texture, there's no unique contours. And we're going to be talking about that more, is unique contours. So an environment is really just a collection of objects that are permanently connected together in a certain configuration in your spatial memory. You're best off taking a picture or a video of each environment that you want to use, or draw it out by hand, so that it's something that's permanent. So even as things change, you're still storing it in a singular form that's unchanging. So now I'm going to go over an example so you can get an idea of how does this work, and how can you store multiple levels of hierarchy. And usually, and I talked about this before in the note-taking course, in terms of how to organize your systems, your files, so that it's most efficient and it's easy enough to memorize, is try to stay to 3 levels of hierarchy or less if you can. It's not always possible to do that, but your brain is going to thank you if you avoid just way too many levels of hierarchy, because your brain can't handle it as well as, for example, a computer can handle it. So be careful with creating too many levels of hierarchy, and err on the side of fewer levels whenever possible. So we're going to start out with our basic model, which is a bathroom, and it's got these 5 objects within it that are all part of the environment. So you've got a shower, you've got a toilet, you've got a sink, you've got a window, and then you've got a vent up in the ceiling that vents out the air. That's the first level. That's the primary level. The second level is we're going to take an individual part of that environment or an individual large object. In this case, the sink. So what are 5 parts of the sink? Well, we have a faucet, we have a handle, we have a drain, we have a toothbrush, and we have a toothpaste. And so because the toothbrush and the toothpaste, they're not actually built into the sink, but they always exist there, that's a stable, permanent connection that you can utilize to store things. So as long as it's a connection that exists in your head already, it's something you can use. Even if other people can't use it or it's not true for other people, as long as it's true for that specific environment, then you can use it. Now we're talking about the third level. So we pick one of those 5 things and then we zoom in a level further and we look for 5 different unique contours, unique parts of that object. So we're looking at the toothbrush. It's got circular bristles, it's got a pick tip, it's got a thumb ridge, it's got a neck, and it's got a handle on the bottom of the body, which is the other end of it, the other end of the bristle side. So this doesn't have to be what your toothbrush actually looks like. I was struggling a little bit to think, okay, what are 5 really distinct parts of a toothbrush? So I just imagined, well, what would be a toothbrush that had a lot of different distinct features on it. So that's what you could do for something like this. And if you go into detail on all those original 5 parts that we talked about in the first level of the bathroom, the shower, toilet, sink, window, and vent, at the end of this process, you'll come out with 125 slots, 125 gigabyte mental hard drive. That's the metaphor that I like to use. So once you've got to that level, now you've got a significant amount of information that you can store just based on doing that. And this is 3 levels of hierarchy right here, but you can create more levels of hierarchy by going in the opposite direction. So this is just one room in your apartment, one room in your house. It's only a single room on a certain level of your house or level of your apartment. So if you got a 2-3 story house and maybe a basement also, then you can look at, well, okay, each level of my house will be a different level of hierarchy, and then the house itself will be a level of hierarchy, and I'll group in other houses that I've lived in before, or apartments afterwards, or friends' houses that I'm familiar with, or other houses on my street, and then you can memorize all of that and use those as other levels of hierarchy. So now you're talking about 6-7 different levels of hierarchy. And this stuff is really important when you're structuring information, because it makes it easy for you to, whenever you've got built-in spatial memory, like a neighborhood from your childhood that you know like the back of your hand, that's something that's really great to use as like a high level. Think of it as kind of like the desktop of your computer, where you can access everything, all the basic things really quickly. So let's say you're just using the different houses on your neighborhood street when you were growing up. You know all of those houses. You may not have been inside all of them, but each of those houses could represent a major part of your life or a major section of your life in one way or another. And then you can group things into those areas. So it gets really personal for different people, what information you're going to store, what's worth memorizing in this way, and how you're going to organize your mnemonic systems, your memory palaces inside your head. And it really has to do with how are you going to apply this information, and you really need to have it memorized, and is it part of a structure. So this structure right here is an artificial structure. It's completely arbitrary. There's no meaning to it. But a much better system would be something where the subject that you're learning is actually providing to you images and metaphors and examples and frameworks where you can use relevant images to connect to each other and create a framework made out of images that are all relevant and make sense together and form that framework or that structure in your head via pictures. So that's the ideal. This is less than ideal because you're introducing all these artificial structures that are acting as scaffolding. when you do that, that means that you still have another job ahead of you after you get your spaced repetitions and you've got this stuff memorized. And that next step is you've got to integrate all these ideas. You've got to create connections between all of these ideas. So there's a way to get around that, and the way to get around it is to memorize things visually, but in the structure of the framework as it is, not using an artificial structure like this. But sometimes that's the only way you can do it. The only way you can memorize it is to use an artificial structure. So that's why we're talking about it here.